Hello students, welcome back. This is Dr. Mercado speaking. This is a continuation lecture over chapter 19, which deals with support department and joint cost allocation. Now in this short lecture, I am going to be going over exercise BE 19.4. Okay, let me jump into the problem. Okay, now this problem deals with joint cost allocation using the physical units method. Okay, now the problem gives you a lot of information, so it's very important that we classify the information that we need for the problem and the information that is just extra. Okay, so the problem reads: Blake's Blacksmith Company produces two types of shotguns, a 12 gauge and a 20 gauge. The shotguns are made through a joint production process that ultimately produces 30 12 gauge shotguns and 20 20 gauge shotguns and costs a total of $4,000 per batch. So in a batch, they're manufacturing 30 12 gauge shotguns and 20 20 gauge shotguns. And the whole process to manufacture those 50 shotguns is $4,000 per batch. Okay. Now, after the split off point, each type of shotgun goes through an additional crafting process before it is sold. Okay, the additional production process of the 12 gauge shotgun costs $30 per gun, after which it is sold for $180 per gun. Now, the additional production process for the 20 gauge shotgun is $25 per gun, after which it is sold for $150 per gun. Now, they're asking us here to determine the amount of joint production cost allocated to each type of shotgun using the physical units method. Now, all we are interested here is in figuring out how much of the batch, which is the $4,000 cost, is going to be allocated to the 12 gauge and the 20 gauge shotguns. Okay, all of the other information is not really relevant at this point because they're only asking us to determine the amount of the joint production cost, which is what happens at the beginning of the process. After the split off point, the problem says, you know what, it goes through an additional process and the 12 gauge shotgun costs $30, the 20 gauge shotgun costs $25. But that's after the split off point. We are interested in identifying the cost at the batch level so we can split up that batch cost to the 12 and the 20 gauge shotgun. Okay, so I've set up this little Excel template here like always because I love Excel. It just makes it so much easier to be organized and to run your calculations. Okay, so I've got my 12 gauge and my 20 gauge shotgun. Those are the two types that we're producing. Now I'm going to figure out how many guns per batch are we producing. Well, the problem says that we produce 30 12 gauge. It's right here. 30 12 gauge. And then we also produce 20 20 gauge. Okay. So we produce 30 of the 12 gauge and then 20 of the 20 gauge. So how many guns do we produce per batch? We produce 50 guns. Okay. Now we need to figure out the proportion. Okay. My allocation. So I'm going to get my 30 divided by my 50. So I can figure out what percentage is allocated to my 20 gauge shotgun. That gives me 60%. Okay. I'm going to get my 20 divided by my 50. And that gives me 40%. And then combined, that should give you 100. Okay. So it's very good. Okay. So that means that because I am producing more 12 gauge than 20 gauge, I'm going to allocate more of my cost, of my batch cost, to the 12 gauge shotgun. Okay. Now, what is the cost per batch? What am I allocating? Well, the problem said that we are allocating the cost of $4,000 per batch. Okay. $4,000 per batch. So my joint cost is $4,000. Okay. That's my joint cost. Now that I know that I'm allocating $4,000, now I know that my proportion, or you can call this your allocation, whatever makes more sense to you, okay, is 60% for the 12 gauge, 40% for the 20 gauge. I can go ahead and I can calculate my allocation. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get my cost of $4,000 times my allocation of 60%. That gives me a $2,400 allocation to my 12 gauge shotgun. Okay. Then I've got my 4,000 joint cost. This is how much I spent for the entire batch, 4,000. And I'm allocating 40% of that to my 20 gauge shotgun. Okay. That gives me $1,600. Okay. So at the end of the day, I have allocated, or I have split my $4,000 batch cost, $2,400 to my 12 gauge shotgun, and then $1,600 to my 20 gauge shotgun. Okay. So the question was, determine the amount of joint production costs allocated to each type of shotgun. So for the 12 gauge, $2,400. For my 20 gauge, $1,600. Okay. Now, if the problem wanted to go further, they could ask you, well, what is the allocation per gun? And then you can just simply get your allocation of 2,400 and divide by the number of guns that you're producing, and that would give you your allocation per gun. But they've really simplified it for us, made it really easy. They just want to know how much of the $4,000 batch cost is going to be split, or how is it going to be split between the 12 gauge and the 20 gauge. So your answer is this. Okay, 2,400 is going to be allocated to the 12 gauge. 1,600 is going to be allocated to the 20 gauge shotgun. Okay. It's very important that when you're reading the problem, you see all of the information after this point is just extra information to confuse you. Okay. This would be very helpful if they were asking you to calculate what is the cost of each gun. Then you would have to calculate the allocation per gun, add the additional production processes to be able to determine the cost of the gun. But they're not asking us for that, but they're giving us all of that information. So students can get overwhelmed and confused. So it's very important that before you even start working on the problem, you clearly understand the question and you isolate the information that you need to answer the question. Okay, so that is basically it for this particular problem. Until next time, hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.